All right. Uh, Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to PSDRN's seminar. For those new here, PSDRN is a research network consisting of development finance institutions, think tanks, academic institutions, all of which actively support research on private sector development. There'll be a link in the chat box for more information. Today's seminar is hosted by the International Growth Center, IGC for short, founding member of PSDRN. The IGC is a research institution based out of the London School of Economics, who does two main things. One is to fund rigorous economic research that is relevant to low-income countries, and two is to translate these findings into actionable policy, which is led by our country teams, our 10 country teams spread across Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. The paper you'll hear about today is a prime example of IGC work, and you can find out more about IGC on our website, which is also going to be posted in the chat box. My name is Elliot Farron. As you may have guessed, I work for the IGC. I'm a policy economist in the firm's trade and productivity team, and I'll be moderating today's exciting and timely discussion. Exciting because we are going to talk about some really interesting and novel research on local content requirements. And timely because, well, I think we could all use a reminder this week that trade policy can still be informed by evidence. And to deliver this reminder, let me introduce today's speaker, Christian Lipic. Christian holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh and serves as a senior country economist for the IGC in Rwanda. His work focuses on firm productivity, supply chains, international trade, and climate change. He will be presenting groundbreaking research on how rules of origin impact African exports under preferential trade agreements. His team uses an innovative methodology to identify optimal levels of domestic and regional content requirements across different African economies. Just one last word before I pass the word to Christian. Let me get a couple of logistical points out of the way. The presentation is going to last about 40 minutes, after which we will have 15 minutes for a Q&A. If you have any questions, and I do encourage you to ask away, we want this session to be as interactive as possible. Please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. When you do so, please be sure to include your full name and organization as well. Finally, today's session is being recorded. Both video and audio recordings will be made available on the IGC and PSDRN websites after the session. Okay, that's all on my side. Christian, it's a pleasure to have you here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And well, thanks for having me. Let me first, of course, share my screen. Okay. First, this is joint work with Bernard Höckmann and Rohit Tiku, who are at the European University Institute. Marcelo is at the University of Geneva, and Marco is at the University of Turin, and I'm at the IGC. Okay, so let's start with this picture, this figure, because that's like the main underlying concept the whole talk is going to be about, and that's what has been called the theory of the rules of origin Laffer curve. The rules of origin are basically, in most cases, a local content requirement for firms' products to be eligible for preferential trade. So you have to fulfill like a minimum amount of domestic content to make use of lower tariffs. And what this like curve shows is that there's regions along the line of rules of origin where making rules of origin even stricter, beneficiaries' value added in preferential exports will go down, and there's other regions where rules of origin are very like lean and lax, where increasing them actually increases beneficiaries' value added in preferential exports. And then the concept argues there's an intermediate region that not optimizes, optimal is a bit of like a too strong economic word, but maximizes beneficiaries' value added embedded in preferential exports. And that's what the talk is going to be about. And we're going to estimate these like maximizing rules of origin. Let me go one step back. Okay, so rules of origin are very essentially part of almost like any reciprocal or even non-reciprocal trade agreements. So they're very universal. And so mostly the concept refers to local content requirements, right? Like a share of X of your exports need to come from locally like produced value added to be eligible for preferential trade. There's some others, I'm going to talk about that in a second. So what are their goals of the rules of origin? So they aim to prevent trade deflection. So it just means if I'm from like a third party country who want to make use of very low like export tariffs of a second country, I can just like ship my goods to that country and then export from there to make use of that. And the rules of origin aim to prevent that. But they also are a tool to foster development of local industries. If a certain amount of goods has to come from local economy, that aims to like foster development and industrialization. But then, and again, that refers to the Laffer curve, the relationship between like making like rules of origin stricter and the total like beneficiaries value added, the total in private exports, it's non-trivial. To put some words in this Laffer curve, so if you think about like stricter rules of origin and you increase them, then of course mechanically the unit share of one good of domestic value added in private exports goes up. But then limiting the use of competitive foreign inputs can reduce the overall amount of trade that's done preferentially, because firms cannot comply with these rules of origin because they might not be as competitive enough. And that gives kind of like reason to think about is like non-monotonic relationship between like changing rules of origin and the total beneficiaries value added in preferential exports. And it's of course very highly relevant today, given like the recent like changes in international trade. And well, some countries ask for less restrictive rules of origin, for example, the least developed countries group at the WTO, and others ask for more restrictive rules of origin, like the US and the USMCA, or the NAFTA context. Okay, but what about Trump now? What will happen? So I'm going back to like the picture again. Okay, now with that in mind, this kind of like again puts a picture to these words. So when we have like very strict rules of origin and make them even stricter, this could lower the total amount of preferential trade. So lowering them might increase the total amount of preferential trade, even though the unit share of beneficiaries value added goes down. At the same time, if the rules of origin are very like lean, and increasing them might increase the unit share, even though the total amount might goes down. And again, that motivates this intermediate region that maximizes the total amount of beneficiaries value added in preferential trade. So what are we going to do in this paper? So we take this concept of a Laffer curve and we estimate the rules of origin that maximize domestic value added. So we do that by using some structural relationship that formalizes the Laffer curve. And then we use empirical estimates to estimate the parameters of this function. And we use data for all GSP countries and also a subset of African countries. They provide suggestive evidence of like the variations of the maximizing rules of origin at the country level across African countries. And also we zoom in and use some like firm level, transaction level data to explain or look at the status quo of value added and rules of origin in Uganda. Okay, let's go again one step back. So the rationale for rules of origin. So we're going to focus on local content requirements, but these are by far the most common rules of origin, but there's others. For example, to be eligible for preferential trade, it can be that goods have to change their tariff classification. So they go into like a country under one tariff, then they are processed, therefore change their tariff classification, and then they classify as eligible. Or there could also be some very specific process requirement on certain goods, for example, like in the textile sector and the processing here. There's different reasons, and I alluded to some of them before. So again, rules of origin aim to prevent trade deflection or rerouting and of transshipping. Again, another country ships a country into like an eligible country, and then they are exported to make use of lower tariffs. There's been some like pre-Trump evidence that this is not economically rational because trade costs are too high, or like then eventually like exporting country also has tariffs. But again, that's pre-Trump. And now I wanna quote to make it a bit more relevant for the world we're living in. I wanna quote Paul Krugman in his blog from today, who says, "Did anyone think about how to enforce wildly different tariffs on different countries when it would be easy to transship goods? The Republic of Ireland, which is part of the European Union, is supposed to face a 20% tariff, while Northern Ireland, part of Britain, faces only a 10% rate. So can Irish exporters cut their tariffs in half by shipping goods out of Belfast? Will there be elaborate rules of origin to prevent this? And who will devise and enforce these rules?" So it seems like a very relevant topic these days. And we know what's going to happen. Will it be revised? And what will be the implications for the countries whose origin might change? Other reasons include that whose origin can help solving a holdup problem. Could be that like domestic firms might not invest because there's uncertainty whether there's demand for your products, and whose origin reduces uncertainty. There's cases where whose origin attenuate preferential liberalization commitments. So you have a preferential trade agreement, but there's certain like very specific rules that even under these like preferential trade makes it really hard to fulfill these rules of origin requirements. And rules of origin can actually work as some sort of industrial policy. I said that before. If firms have to rely on local inputs, these like upstream sectors will have an impetus to develop, and it can foster private sector and market development, industrialization, maybe upgrading and productivity upgrading, employment gains. Even though, and again, that refers to like we are talking about maximizing rules of origin, not optimal rules of origin. Even though this might not be like welfare enhancing, because we cannot make use of maybe cheaper, more competitive international inputs. But maybe that's just a static, and the like increased investment in the medium to long run increases welfare gains. Putting this into a context of ESC and Uganda, in terms of like how rules of origin could be used as a tool of industrial policy. There's an industrial policy at the ESC which aims to enhance domestic value added through trade policies. And the ESC actually has a quite strict rules of origin level at 35% relative to other African communities, with some extra provisions even. On the national level, Uganda has a Buy Uganda, Build Better policy. Again, Rwanda is made in Rwanda. These are policies that foster domestic development. And rules of origin can be seen as one of the broader set of instruments to pursue these goals. But then on the flip side, strict rules of origin can also erode preferential market access to very restrictive rules of origin. It's like basically two parts of the literature. One looks at all different kinds of rules of origin and tries to look at these different kinds and compute or calculate like different indices of the restrictiveness and how they affect trade. And then there's like very quantitative techniques that look at how do rules of origin impact trade flows, and also therefore preference utilization. And we're gonna build on the second strand. To zoom in a bit more, our structural model will be based on Head et al. And they formalize this rules of origin thinking into a model. And they actually find that in the context of NAFTA, when they moved from 65% to 75% for automotives and to the rules of origin, that actually led to lower employment due to higher production costs. And then also we built very heavily on Canadian and Oriaga, so one of the core authors, and they estimate the maximized rules of origin for domestic value added in exports. And they find that these estimated maximized rules of origin actually align very closely with the actual ones in the EU. Okay, so now this is going to be the painful part of the talk. Now we go through the model and through the technical parts. Okay, so this structure model starts with this identity. So we have on the left-hand side the beneficiaries, value added, and preferential exports. I don't say domestic, I said beneficiaries, because in a group of countries that are eligible for the same preferential trade agreement, rules of origin also allow for accumulation of inputs. So if Uganda imports from Rwanda, that also counts towards like domestic content, and that is equal to the share of beneficiaries value added and times the total value of preferential exports. So share of all preferential exports then amount to the beneficiaries value added in preferential exports. Assumption of that is, in that identity is rules of origin. Again, this is like not on the individual level, it's at the aggregate level. And the rules of origin have to be binding for at least some firms for this kind of relationship to hold. Then the share of beneficiaries value added is monotonically increasing with rules of origin. Again, given that it must be binding, we assume it's been binding for some firms. And then X is monotonically decreasing with rules of origin. Again, the reason here, firms might not be as competitive anymore or can comply with these requirements. Okay, so with that in mind, now comes some math. So we want to find the rules of origin that maximize the beneficiaries value added. So we take the first order condition, set it equal to 0, just a standard econ 101 approach. And then we get this equation. So what do we observe? We observe X. We observe the value of preferential trade, but we do not observe alpha. We don't observe the share of the preferential trade that it comes from domestic input suppliers. Okay, so what do? We assume a relationship between the domestic share and rules of origin. That's the most structural part here. And later we're going to use Ugandan like firm level data to confront these assumptions with some like more granular data. Okay, what are these like assumed like functional relationships? We assume these two in the paper. We also tried some others. These function forms get us closest to like the data in Uganda. So we are assuming like a linear relationship. The rules of origin go up proportionally with the share of domestic value added, or a geometric function, so that the share is always a bit above these like rules of origin, because they're not binding, most likely not binding for all firms. Okay, these are some like very like desirable features. So alpha is always bigger or smaller than roots of origin. They're between 0 and 1. Okay, so then we combine this. So we had the so we can go back here. We have this relationship, the first order condition, and now we can plug in our functional forms and get these relationships. So as a function where the maximizing of origin is a function of preferential trade only, the value of preferential trade. For the geometric function, we cannot solve it explicitly. We don't have a closed form solution. We have to solve it numerically. Okay, so how do we get this relationship? So we estimate, that comes the empirical part, we estimate X and using a standard like gravity model of trade. So we explain like the variation in bilateral trade with the European Union and preferential beneficiaries, and using the very standard like supply demand factors, as well as the bilateral trade costs. So let's go to the specification of the gravity equation. So again, X is the amount of preferential trade at the country, product, and the time level. And this is equal to, again, a standard gravity equation. And here, the betas refer to fixed effects, so exporter time, product time, and exporter product fixed effects to account for different like features. We got also some bilateral trade costs. So what do we use? We use the preferential trade margin. It's the ratio of most favored nation to the actual preferential tariff of that country. And the share of value added in preferential exports, which we do want to explain. We don't have data for that, so we use our assumption. And that's what we're doing here. Again, we have these functional form assumptions. We replace alpha with these assumptions, and this is what we get. And now, this is what we can estimate. We have data for everything in these equations and can estimate the parameters in front of the rules of origin. If you, again, take the first derivative with respect to rules of origin, what do we get? And then divide by x. Then we get these like semi-elasticities. And these were part of our derived maximizing rules of origin. We can plug that in, and then we have a expression estimated from the data about optimizing rules of origin. If you plug these relationships in 10, 11 into 12 and 13, we are there. We observe we don't observe the maximizing rules of origin, but we estimated gamma and psi, so we have a function for maximizing the rules of origin of maximizing of origin, which is the peak of the Laffer curve. Again, we also do some math to get the standard deviations, see how significant our estimates are, and then we're good to go. So how do we identify these parameters? We have some across time variation within products and exporters. We do have that because the EU has implemented some rules of origin reforms. Then we need a variation across exporters within product and years. And there's different like rules of origin specifications depending on GSP, GSP plus, and also everything but arms. And we have variation across products within an exporter year. And that's our main source of variation because there we find the strongest variation that which we use to actually identify our parameters. Let me quickly talk about the data that we use. We focus on the time frame between 2008 and 19. We got the rules of origin. We use the rules of origin facilitator and find that the median for all GSP countries is 50%. For only African countries, 30%. Then for export, we use the WTO integrated database and Eurostat. And we also to get also the amount of preferential trade. And we find that 59% of GSP beneficiaries actually traded, were traded preferentially, but only 8% for Africa. So it seems like perhaps the rules of origin might be very demanding for African exports, and exporters cannot make use of preferential trade agreements. We got some data on Paris from ITC, and then further data we got from the Uganda Revenue Authority. Okay, so let's look at some numbers, some summary statistics for the EU on preferential access regimes. The top of the figure is for all GSP countries and their trade to the EU. You see in value added, the mean is 46%. You also get a maximum of 60%. And at the bottom, you got only like a subset of African countries. You see that mean is a bit lower, and but also but apart from that, it's very similar. But there's a lot of variation within countries. Okay, so then let's look at the results of our gravity equation again to pin down the coefficient of rules of origin, to pin down the maximized rules of origin. So we got two specifications, the linear and the geometric one. We first estimated for all GSP exporters, and we find that the preference margin, if it goes up, right, then it's like the benefits or the advantage goes down. So the other way around. So it has a positive coefficient. The preference margin has a negative coefficient for African exporters, which is not expected. But it can also mean there's some like reverse causality, meaning that the preference margin might be in favor of less developed industries in African exports. That's why maybe there's this negative relationship. The rules of origin coefficient has the expected coefficient, and it is negative. Meaning, if rules of origin become stricter, the total amount of preferential trade value goes down. Again, that does not refer to the domestic share of that, but the total amount. And you see the relationship seems to be stronger in African countries, even though we cannot estimate the coefficient for the geometric specification at a statistically significant level. Okay, so from there we get our coefficients for gamma MC and can plug them into a relationship of the maximized rules of origin, and this is what we get. Okay, so again, both specifications, the linear function and the geometric function. And if we estimate for all GSP exporters, we see that the maximum origin level is around 40%, 41 or 43 for the given different specifications. But then look at the African exporters. And here we find a significant difference. So given when we use the linear specification, the maximizing level is just 18%. And for the geometric function, it is 21%. I had to say, given the standard errors, that we cannot say at a statistical significant level that these are different between all GSP exporters and African exporters. But the point estimates are indicative of some differences between these like two groups. Okay, but what we also do is we estimate these gravity equations for individual African countries, only making making use of product level variation within countries having year fixed effects. And here you also see very strong differences. When you look, for example, at the linear specification, you see that Uganda has maximizing roots of origin at 9%, while South Africa has 50%. And for the geometric specification, South Africa has 60%, while Mauritius has 7%. So this is indicative of very strong difference. Again, these estimates are not perfectly estimated, but the point estimates are strongly indicative. Okay, so that also means, given like the current levels of the average level of roots of origin with the EU, some are below, the maximizing ones, some are below, some are above. Again, pointing to this non-monotonicity. This is basically what I just said. Okay, but can we start thinking about linking these to other explanatory variables? What explains these differences? And we have a few hypotheses and a few correlations. So first hypothesis: more developed and larger economies, like South Africa, have more developed domestic value chains, and therefore it is easier for these countries to provide the inputs, and therefore for countries to fulfill the rules of origin requirements to trade preferentially. And this correlation is again a bit indicative of that. So Africa is the outlier. So I would say the R squared not by X would be not super high, but it's indicative of this positive relationship between economic development, market size, and optimal rules of origin. The second hypothesis is, if a country is larger, has a larger dependence on imports, and it cannot produce certain goods domestically, then again, the lower the rules of origin, the maximizing rules of origin. And again, our results again are indicative of that. And last but not least, the hypothesis is, if you have more investment in your country, so more FDI, this also increases your productive capacities within the country, and therefore it's easier for a country to fulfill the rules of origin requirements, again, having explanatory power about these maximizing rules of origin. It seems there's like some evidence towards that. Again, these are correlations. Okay. There are some potential additional estimates. So what I just talked about could be explicitly included in our estimates to account for more heterogeneity across countries. So we could have like a more flexible semi-elasticity depending on development, economic size, openness, to account for this explicitly. And what I said before, the primary source of variation in our estimation is across products. That's where the variation happens. So therefore, we tried this, but it's statistically infeasible to measure effects at the product level, because there's not a lot of variation within a given product, just across products. And the same is also for within a sector, and there's variation, as there was only one GSP reform. We try estimating our limit, reducing the sample to just manufacturing, or at the HS2 level. And what we find is, using the geometric function, geometric specification, we find that the maximizing rules of origin are around 11%, while 21% for all sectors. But again, we lack the variation here, and the estimate is statistically insignificant. Okay, so I said in the beginning that we also contrast like our or compare our our functional assumptions about the relationship between domestic value share and rules of origin with some actual like more granular data. And we got access to tax data from the Uganda Revenue Authority that gives us like data at the transaction level. So for domestic trade, but also from customs data, so imports and exports. And what we do is we first compute the the domestic value added in total sales of a given firm. Right, so we have the total sales, and what we subtract is the intermediate inputs these firms use, import directly, but also we account for the fact that these firms also source from domestic countries, but these domestic firms might be using a lot of imported goods. So we account for this by using like the share of inputs like a firm I purchased from another firm, and then their inputs of the intermediate goods. You could continue this. You could say also like the second level firms also import and continue like this. But also in practice, rules of origin are not, when they're actually like checked by importing companies, they don't go that far and look at like the seventh firm upstream in the value chain. And so it's a reasonable assumption. Okay. Also, for a given firm, we need to make an assumption that this share applies to all markets, but because we don't know the functional forms, we don't know what inputs are used then to trade with the EU or sell domestically. So we say, okay, the total share is basically what applies to the domestic market, the EU market, and Argentina, and so on. But what we can do is we can compute this like the median across firms for one market. So let's look at all firms export to the EU and what's their mean or median share of domestic inputs. And what we find for Ugandan exporters to the EU is that the domestic share is 44%. And with the mean rules of origin, with the actual rules of origin at 41%, so actually applied rules of origin. Then again, tracking our functional forms, if you plug in the actual like share that we estimated of when you actually plug in the actual rules of origin, then the linear function would imply that that the optimal rules of origin are the rules of origin that are 41%. Sorry, excuse me. That the domestic share is 41%. If you again use like the 41% at the EU, putting that into the geometric function, that suggests that the domestic share is 51%. Okay, but the share that we estimate from the data that we compute is 44%. So it seems like the actual like share is somewhere between both our specifications, one underestimating, one overestimating the share a little bit, but they are not far off. Okay, so what can we learn from Uganda? So what we find is that on average, Ugandan firms actually match the rules of origin requirements, meaning that their domestic share is equal or above the rules of origin requirement. That's for 74% of the firms, 94 in agriculture, 67 in mining, 51 in manufacturing. And it's very similar even for like peak rules of origin. 41 was just the average. Even like peak rules of origin are satisfied by 59% of trade volume. So that suggests that rules of origin don't have to be that restrictive, or are not that restrictive for Ugandan preference utilization. So, but what we do before we find with our estimation is that the domestic share maximizing levels of rules of origin, is 9% or 10% given like the geometric specification. So even though Ugandan firms often can fulfill the rules of origin, it doesn't mean that it is efficient or welfare enhancing, because firms cannot make use of competitive, cheap, high quality foreign imports. So our estimates suggest that lowering rules of origin restriction would boost preferential exports. Okay, and that means also that the low preference utilization of just 20% could have other reasons. So not just the rules of origin levels per se, but maybe complex origin procedures and red tape. Okay, good. So we're almost at the end. Summary of the findings. So our estimates suggest there is a non-monotonic relationship between export to domestic value added in preferential exports, right? We got our applied level, and then we got some like maximizing what's already scattered around it. So it could matter where you are on the rules of origin lava curve, referring to meaning that for some countries might be optimal or maximizing to lower them, or some to increase them. But there's a lot of diversity within GSP beneficiaries, while they are mostly applied uniformly. And then we look at the comparison between African countries and the general average GSP exporter. The maximized limits of origin are estimated to be 50% lower for African countries, perhaps given the reasons I alluded to, like lower levels of development. And again, there's also a lot of heterogeneity within Africa, perhaps given the same reasons of different levels of development, different levels of trade openness. And therefore, we find like an upward sloping relation between different variables, like rules of origin and economic size. And this is my last slide, some remarks and some like maybe implications. So our estimates are error prone. So we would benefit from using some more granular firm level data like we do for Uganda to estimate these relationships. We do not, in our estimates, take into account the regional accumulation. That would make rules of origin less strict. But we also do not take into account other costs, like other rules of origin, and also different costs to comply with rules of origin. Our estimate suggests that most African countries would benefit from lower rules of origin to the EU, as these like maximizing rules of origin are lower than the current like rules of origin, or at least elimination of peaks, reaching up to 60%. The results suggest having like the restrictiveness therefore like varying with economic size and level of development. But if you think about it in, let's say, amongst like African countries, like negotiating different rules of origin with every single country or even within products could also add to a lot of like more cost. It could just be impractical. But what we think could be a very reasonable thing for governments to do is using like replicating this exercise we did with the Ugandan data and using this micro transaction level data when designing or adjusting rules of origin to evaluate the effects on domestic regional value added. So if you can contrast the current like negotiated or under discussion rules of origin with the current state or like domestic share of a certain product or sector, you get a better idea where you are relative to these rules of origin and get more knowledge about whether you will be able to make use of preferential trade agreements or not. And I stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Christian. That was great. Just a reminder that if you have any questions for Christian, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll be sure to get to them. While we wait for people to come up with some questions. Oh, there's one. Does the Laffer hypothesis take into account the fact that several countries benefit from preferential access and competition for market access between these countries will incentivize them to minimize their value add?
So it's a question about countries within a preferential trade agreement. That would refer to the accumulation of beneficiaries value added that one country can source from another country would account towards rules of origin, if that's the question.
So I think kind of tangential to this question is how good is this as an industrial policy? Is this is this you show findings about static effects, especially on supply chains, and the question is dynamically, is the model able to see any dynamic effects, or just you in your research have you seen any evidence of this being like a successful industrial policy?
In that paper, on this paper, we have not looked into these like more dynamic effects. And yeah, I don't have, me personally, I haven't seen a paper on this, but it would be like very interesting research. Yeah, but personally, I don't know, and I haven't seen it.
Okay, we have another question, actually, I think is a follow-up. Did you include EPA preferences in your regression?
No, not yet. So there is definitely like more things we could include. One thing that limits us a little bit is like the level or the degree of like variation that we have in the data, and it's like making it more complex could be very taxing for the estimates that already kind of like suffer a little bit from the degree of variation. We suggest a few like changes, like making it a bit more complex and accounting for heterogeneity. But we have limited the number of variables to address like the degree of variation that we have or can make use of.
Okay. Jean-Christophe, I see that you have your hand up in the chat. It's easier for us if you can just type your questions in the Q&A. It'll just be an easier way to go about. Wubet Kasa asks, is a fascinating study. One, how important are the functional forms? If we vary them, do the results hold? And two, how relevant is tailoring, say within AFCFTA, since the value added come from members, not just one country?
Yeah, on the first question, yeah, we also tried out different functional forms. For example, like a square root function. Here, when we compare it to a linear specification, and results differ quite significantly. So therefore, we then in the end we decide to go for the linear and the geometric specification because, well, first of all, they are very close together, and then we confront it with the Ugandan data, and it's quite close. But again, these are assumptions. We need some structure given our lack of data. But yes. And how relevant is tailoring, say within AFCTA, since the value added could come from members, not just one country. Again, do you mean by that, you mean like the accumulation of domestic value added? If that's the question, yes. Again, there could be like quite a lot of relevance here, and user origin might not be that strict if you can also source from like countries in the same preferential trade group. But at the same time, we also don't account like for other costs. Like I said, in the end, we don't account for other rules of origin, like product specifications or just red tape, just like the compliance costs. So I'm not saying it kind of averages out, but with both sides are not right now not included.
Yeah, I mean, a personal question. I was actually going to ask about these compliance costs. How costly are they, and are they important for this analysis? And do they differ by country?
Well, I know that answers your question, but there's estimates about with origin that are a bit more flexible, and some gravity equations show that if with origin are a bit more flexible, I guess make it easier to comply. This has a less damaging effect on preferential trade.
Okay. Jean-Christophe has a follow-up question. What about wholly obtained products? Do you consider them as equivalent to 100% VA requirement?
Can you say can you tell me what you mean by that?
Okay, let's let Jean-Christophe detail his question a bit more. Regina asks, you found that the optimal restrictiveness of rules of origin to maximize domestic value added differs across Africa. Given this heterogeneity, what are the policy implications for the design of a harmonization of rules of origin framework under the FTA? Sorry.
Yeah, I tried to allude to that at the end of the talk. So we just take our results straightforward. Then that would mean that there should also be heterogeneity, more heterogeneity across countries, because countries are at different levels of of rules of origin. And for South Africa, rules of origin can be stricter, while vice versa, maybe for Uganda. The policy implication of that would be okay, have some either like varying rules of origin across countries, or have some rules of origin that are time varying, right? That start a bit laxer, give countries time to kind of to develop local industries and then become stricter. But then the flip side of that is that there's a lot of like political like red tape, negotiating these and having this like a very like this like fragmented framework of rules of origin. The cost of that might be too high.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I think Jean-Christophe has a few clarifications, so we can give you a moment to speak if that's easiest.
Yes, thanks. Thanks about that. It's hard to type sometimes. First, I mean, Ruben's question was not about cumulation. I think it was
Okay.
what Regina asked. It was really about having different. You kind of answered that question about differentiated origin regimes by country of origin. I'm a bit unsure about that policy recommendation. I mean, you have some reservation as well, and I agree with them because I don't know the model, the head and co model, but is it a multi-country model or is it just a two-country model? Because my intuition is that if you have like let's say 10 countries, competing for market access, basically they are all going to minimize their costs. So they are going to they might minimize their value added, because if that's a consequence of minimizing their cost and to meet the least restrictive rule of origin. So I mean, when you see variation, I think it's super interesting. But to me, the policy implication would be, okay, it indicates, what should be the floor. I don't think it necessarily indicates that you should vary your rules of origin because it would be more optimal in terms of maximizing the value added, in some countries of that export. So that's the first point. And very quickly, my clarification on my question, the wholly obtained products, they have to be fully produced in one country. So that's equivalent to 100% value added requirement. So I was just wondering whether you thought about including these products in such a way in your regression and see whether that affects your results. Thanks.
Thanks. To address your first point, if I understand right, it seems it addressed a little bit like the difference between optimal and like, let's say, maximizing. So our like estimates are not the optimal route of origin at, let's say, the firm level, right? Optimal would be a firm can source from the best firm possible, whether it's imported or domestic. But if we treat it as like industrial policy, right? Again, this doesn't refer to like optimal policy, but we want to foster domestic development. That's what we're referring to. We don't refer to optimal and cost minimizing. On your second point on the wholly obtained goods.
Sorry, Christian, may I
Yes.
follow up, because I think I didn't express my question clearly. I think what your regression shows indeed are maybe the appropriate level of origin depending on the country of origin, and that's an interesting result. But from a policy perspective, in practice, when you have several countries that compete against each other to access the EU market, they are not going to pick the optimal level where they maximize their value added. They are going to cost minimize. So if I'm South Africa, I could be capable of meeting a 50% value added requirement, but it might be least costly, to produce only with 10% value added because I'm competing against Lesotho. That's my point, So therefore, you cannot really implement, different rules of origin by if you have like several countries, you know, having similar the same market access. The only rule of origin that makes policy sense is the lowest one. You know, if you want to give access to everyone, that's my point.
Yeah, I agree, and I guess our paper assumes a certain objective function, a policy objective function, that we are saying is a different objective function, and that's why, yeah, that's why
Yes.
it differs.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with you.
Okay.
On your second point of wholly obtained, so I'm not aware of like the precise details here, but wholly obtained sounds a bit like this is like a very product specific rule and not a content requirement.
It's for agricultural products and forestry products. So generally, that's a type of rule, you know. And it's kind of it's just, you know, I mean, listening to you, I thought about that. I say to me, it's like 100%. I mean, the value added, you know, that. No, it's not 100%. No, sorry. Yeah, I misspoke. It's not 100% value added requirement. It's a requirement that all the value added must be produced in the exporting country. So that's different. So yeah, you can ignore my question.
Yeah, that's a product specific requirement and not a content requirement, and therefore not in our data. Elliot, you're on mute.
No, sorry. I was. Thanks for your reply. No more things
Thanks
to
for
come.
asking.
Thanks, Jean-Christophe. Yeah, sorry. So I was going to say, please keep the questions coming, but in the meantime, kind of want to zoom out a little bit, and it sounds to me like, you know, the EU in particular, they're using environmental regulation as a trade policy with CBAM, with EUDR, so carbon border adjustment mechanism and EU deforestation regulation. Is there an interaction between these rules of origin and these kind of requirements? And how is it going to kind of combine and affect exporters? I mean, we're in a world where, I mean, we heard it a couple of days ago, you know, trade is changing and policy barriers might be going up. So are these rules of origin going to change as well in the future? And how do they interact with existing environmental regulations?
I mean, I guess everybody can maybe has an opinion on that. So they're different in the way that rules of origin, well, basically address like a third country, right? In the trade with a third country. And while these requirements that you just kind of alluded to, CBAM and EUDR, they're more about just a domestic specification of production and value chains. The impact might be similar, that firms have a hard time trading preferentially, and preference utilization might be lower in a similar way to both, even though they come from a different starting point. Whether they will change, I mean, I can just like try to like kind of like say that what Krugman said. When you think about all the tariffs that are being imposed now, and this is just maybe just the start, and the example that Krugman gave about Ireland and Northern Ireland, there might be more of like economic rationale to ship or to export your goods through a third country, which would then bring rules of origin again more into the spotlight, and which then would lead to changes preventing that from the importing country. Whether they will change and how they will be implemented, I can only guess.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I think if no one has any more questions, I think we can end it here. Christian, thank you so much for taking the time to share your research today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to the audience for joining us for a lively discussion. The next IGC PSDRN seminar is going to be on May 16th and led by Emanuele Colonelli of Chicago Booth. He'll be sharing some insights from an incredibly detailed survey dataset on startups in Africa. All details for this event can be found on PSDRN and IGC websites that were shared at the start of the seminar. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, Christian, and have a great afternoon, morning, wherever you are.
Have a good day. Thanks everybody for coming.
Bye.
So,
I'm going to end the webinar.
okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.